Hello and welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. Um, I'm going to jump right into this, and you have to forgive my voice. I'm a little bit hoarse this morning, a little bit more than usual. um, but the subject matter is such that I really wanted to be able to get into this today because I think it'll also help us all with our research on reparations and other areas of that nature. Um, in doing research about, in terms of reparations, I often come across information that I just never heard of, as I'm quite sure that some of you all have done the same thing. One of them, one of these things occurred just recently when I came across the names of what are supposedly the two most ruthless and outrageous slave traders in the United States. They became very, very rich and did a lot of other things in terms of with the money they made, and I had never heard of them. Their names were Isaac Franklin and John Armfield. They were known as, well, their own nicknames. They called themselves pirates and one-eyed men. One-eyed men was a euphemism for their penises. They bought and sold thousands of African people. And they also were known for how much they abused black women. They sold a lot of what we call fancy maids, which I'll get to a little bit later on. And it was known that they raped often, including Franklin's nephew, James, who wrote about it in many of his business correspondence. He worked for them. And here's a quote from one of his business correspondents. Quote, "To my certain knowledge, she has been used and smartly by a one-eyed man about my size and age." Now, he was writing about a woman by the name of Carolyn Brown, an enslaved woman who suffered repeated rape and abuse at James's hands for 5 months. She was 18 years old and just over 5 feet tall. Now, Franklin and Armfield headquartered their business, their slave trading business, in a townhouse that still stands to this day. In fact, that's a graphic of it right there. It's in Alexandria, Virginia. And Franklin and Armfield sold more enslaved people, separated more families, and made more money from the slave trade than almost anyone else in America. Between the 1820s and 1830s, the two men reigned as the, quote, undisputed tycoons of the domestic slave trade, as Smithsonian Magazine put it. Smithsonian Magazine, that's, dealing with the Smithsonian Institute or Smithsonian Museum, and it's a bunch of them with the Smithsonian. So I said, how could this be that I had never run across their names? Here's Franklin, Isaac Franklin, and here's Armfield. Dealers in slaves. And you look at that, you say, wow, they were right out there, weren't they? Now here's a marker that was put up at their office on Duke Street. Let me read this to you. It says, Franklin and Armfield Slave Office, 1315 Duke Street. Isaac Franklin and John Armfield leased this brick building with access to the wharves and docks in 1828 as a holding pen for enslaved people being shipped from Northern Virginia to Louisiana. They purchased the building and 3 lots in 1832. From this location, Armfield bought bondspeople, that's another name for slaves, at low prices and shipped them south to his partner Franklin in Natchez, Mississippi, and New Orleans, Louisiana, to be sold at higher prices. By the 1830s, they often sold 1,000 people annually, operating as one of the largest slave trading companies in the United States until 1836. Slave traders continuously owned the property until 1861. Now bear in mind, the Civil War broke out in what? Was it 1863 and ended in 1865? So they did it right up to the Civil War. Let me show you some of the stuff that went on. In fact, they were notorious. Well, let me show you this. Cash for 500 Negroes, including both sexes from 12 to 25 years of age. Persons having likely servants to dispose of will find it to their interest to give us a call, as we will give higher prices in cash than any other purchaser who is now or may hereafter come into this market. Franklin and Armfield. They were dealing heavy cash, and they were, that reminds me of how in our neighborhoods you'll see signs pop up, we pay cash for your house. Yeah. Cash in market. The subscribers having leased for a term of years the large 3-story brick house on Duke Street in the town of Alexandria, D.C., formerly occupied by General Young, we wish to purchase 150 likely young Negroes of both sexes between the ages of 8 and 25 years. Persons who wish to sell will do well to give us a call, as we are determined to give more money than any other purchases that are in market or that may hereafter come into market. Blah, 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 address, etc. Now, look at that, Washington, Alexandria, and Baltimore. I'm going to get back to this in a minute because there's some important things. Now, this went on a lot. Here's an ad, 100 Negroes for sale at Foster Slave Depot, Collins Street at this time. 100 likely Negroes for sale. Number one, field hands, cooks, washers, and ironers. A number one carpenter, a number one engineer. Through the entire year will be found a large and well-selected lot of Negroes purchased expressly for this market, and will be receiving new supplies every week during the season. Having leased the house formerly occupied by Messrs. Peterson and Stewart as a slave depot, in addition to my place, will be able to furnish traders with Negroes for sale comfortable quarters. I shall in all cases endeavor to give satisfaction to all parties. That's Thomas Foster, 157 Common Street. See, we don't see this, even when you see the slave movies, you don't see the intricate sales and marketing that went on. Check this one out. Slaves and mules too. Oh, excuse me. Slaves, forks of the road, Natchez. I'm going to come back to this too, or go into depth a little bit deeper about this. Natchez, Mississippi. The subscribers have just arrived in Natchez and are now shopping at Mr. Elam's house, forks of the road, with a choice selection of slaves consisting of mechanics, field hands, cooks, washers and ironers, and general house servants. Same thing they said before, that they would be receiving additions to their present supply during the seasons. To those purchasers desiring it, the Louisiana guarantee will be given. The Louisiana guarantee. Mules just arrived in an excellent order, a large lot of mules raised in Missouri. See, it was nothing but a sales and marketing thing going on. Now, here's where I got to get into this word coffles, because I'm pretty. But first, let me explain this part. Coffles was a word that was used to describe basically what became known as chain gangs. Coffles was a type of handcuffs or yokes. They were used on the hands and on the ankles. But coffles, the word meant a group of slaves who were chained together. Like I say, we've seen them many times. Just didn't realize what we were looking at. See, certain words came to be used exclusively for black people, like the word ghetto. Ghetto is a word that was used in Germany as a word that described the neighborhoods where Jews were forced to live. It transferred over here to the United States and came to be used in neighborhoods that were heavily Jewish. And then when the Jews moved out, black people moved in, and ghetto came to be used exclusively to describe some black neighborhoods, ghettos. Well, coffles, which is an old word, came to be used exclusively for groups of black slaves or enslaved Africans who were grouped together and chained up together. Now, I'm going to take a second and I want you to watch something that uh, you probably didn't pay much attention to in the past, but I want you to check this out. I know you probably recognize those graphics from the movie Django with Jamie Foxx and DiCaprio and all of them. And that's from the beginning of the movie where Jamie Foxx's character got unchained. Now, see, we never asked ourselves, where were they going? They were chained up and they were being walked somewhere, marched somewhere. And now that I brought it to your attention, you probably said, I've seen this before. I've seen this in movies before. And see, we automatically, if we see them being marched in Africa, we generally assume they were being marched to the place where they would be shipped over out of Africa somewhere. But when we see them obviously in United States, where were they being marched to? Uh-huh. See, this is never discussed. But let me share with you something. They call it a forced migration. Now, here's the deal, though. This forced migration was from upper South to lower South. Think about that for a minute. Why would there have been this movement, and I'm talking about close to 1 million, if not more, of African people moved from upper South to lower South? Here's why. Most of the Africans who were brought here from the islands or directly from Africa were brought in around Richmond, Virginia. And from there, they were sold off. They also had a bunch that went up in the Northeast, up there in New York and stuff. You know, where Wall Street is today, that was once a place where they sold Africans. So they were spread out a lot of different places. The majority of enslaved Africans was not in the Deep South then. But when the cotton gin was invented, there was now a need for a lot more slaves. They needed them because with the cotton gin, they could do a lot more cotton. Um, Cotton became king. Now, you know, for those that know the presentations I've done, cotton was not the only crop. There was cotton, there was tobacco, there was rice, there was hemp, and one more I can't think of it right now. But at a certain point, cotton became king. And when they outlawed the bringing of Africans, importing Africans into the United States and into the Caribbean from Africa, they needed a lot more slaves. So they created breeding farms. The expression said um, they were sold down south, further south, in chain gangs. Those are coffles, chain gangs. They were chained up together, and there was a trail. As you're looking at this graphic, and I hope you've been looking at it, slave trading routes from 1810 to 1860. And look over on the left-hand side down there on the bottom where it says key. Main routes by land and sea. And what do you see there? Armfield Coffle route and the Waller Coffle route. You see this? And look at the routes. Follow the arrows. They were going from upper south to lower south, and they were headed where? Down to Natchez, Mississippi, and then to New Orleans. New Orleans became the #1 place for slave sales in the. And people like Armfield and Franklin, they were buying slaves. You saw the ads. They were buying them from people who had them on their plantations and working for them on their farms, because the hottest commodity in the 1810s, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s was slaves. They needed them slaves down south. So you had all kinds of people selling their slaves. You follow me? See, that's never really been talked about. The idea that folks would have, like, oh, maybe they might have 50 slaves or they might have 20 slaves, and they needed money. So they sold off their slaves, broke up families, and they sold them to Armfield and Franklin. A lot of them were sold to them. And then they marched them down south to New Orleans where they were sold. Let me show you that. In fact, it was kind of deep how they did this, because let me give you some straight up information. Uh, hmm. Yeah, they bought and sold so many slaves that in 1832, 5% of all the commercial credit available through the Second Bank of the United States had been extended to their firm. 5%. of all the commercial credit available to the Second Bank of the United States. That was a huge amount of money, credit extended to their firm. So what they would do, they would put together these big coffles, a group of enslaved people. And let me be clear, as the ads told you, Africans Africans were not these uneducated, no-skilled slaves. The ads tell you what they were: seamstresses, nurses, valets, field hands, carpenters, cooks, houseboys, coachmen, laundresses, boatmen. And then they also had what they called fancy girls. They were mostly women who had been sexually abused and used as sex slaves, and always children. You saw it in the ads, talking about as young as 8 years old, children. Now, let me see if I can find this real quick. They kept them in these, when they were putting the coffles together, they put them in these pens, slave pens, as they put them together. And one person described it. He said 4 or 5 tents were spread out, and there were large wagons which were to accompany the expedition, and they would be piled high with provisions and other necessities. New clothes were loaded in bundles. Each Negro is furnished with 2 entire suits, and which they do not wear on the road. Instead, these clothes were saved for the end of the trip, so each slave could dress well for the sale. And then there was a pair of carriages. Now, how this worked was, once they were assembled, Armfield sat on his horse in front of the procession, armed with a gun and a whip. Other white men, similarly armed, were arrayed behind them. They were guarding 200 men and boys lined up in twos, their wrists handcuffed together, a chain running the length of 100 pairs of hands. Behind the men were the women and girls, another 100. They were not handcuffed, although they might have been tied with rope. Some carried small children. After the women came the big wagons. They carried food, plus children too small to walk 10 hours a day. Later, these same wagons hauled those who had collapsed and could not be roused with a whip. It was a 1,000-mile long river of people, all of them black, reaching from Virginia to Louisiana. Listen to that, I'm going to say it again. A 1,000-mile long river of people, reaching. During the 50 years before the Civil War, about 1 million enslaved people moved from the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, to the Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. This forced migration was 20 times larger than Andrew Jackson's Indian removal campaign. Remember, they had the Trail of Tears for the Native Americans. And that drove the native people out of Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. It was bigger than the immigration of Jews into the United States during the 19th century, when some 500,000 arrived from Russia and Eastern Europe. It was bigger than the wagon train migration to the west. This movement lasted longer and grabbed up more people than any other migration in North America before 1900. Virginia was the source of the largest deportation. About 450,000 people were sent south from the state between 1810 and 1860. In 1857 alone, the sale of people in Richmond, Virginia, amounted to $4 million. That would be more than $440 million today. Now let's look closer at this map again. All right, look up there, find Richmond, Virginia up on the right-hand side about, you see Virginia, you see Baltimore, you see Maryland, you see Richmond, Norfolk, Virginia, okay? And they marched them. Now remember, they were marched. They were marched, y'all. This is what got me. I never saw this, never read about this. They marched these black folks 1,000 miles. Some they put on boats. As you can see over here on the right-hand side, you see where some of them left out of Norfolk, and they put them on ships and boats and sent them all the way around underneath Florida and around to Louisiana. But they marched them down through Wilmington, Delaware, and down. Ah, when they say they sold them down the river, they went through Atlanta, they went through Georgia, they went through Kentucky, and then around through Memphis, and down through Mississippi, down to Natchez, Mississippi, and then on to New Orleans. They went through Montgomery, Alabama, down through Mobile. You see, I'm telling you, this was huge, and this went on. Now, Franklin and Armfield put more people on the market than anyone, over 25,000 people, and they broke up the most families and made the most money. About half of those were put on ships in Washington or Norfolk bound for Louisiana, where they sold them. The other half walked from the Chesapeake to the Mississippi River, 1,100 miles, with river boats for short distances along the way. Franklin and Armfield's marches began in the late summer, sometimes the fall, and they took 2 to 4 months. The Armfield Coffle of 1834 is better documented than most slave marches. I'm going to read you some things about that. This just kills me because they were doing this and we had no clue. We had no clue. I'll read you that in a minute there. Men and boys, on average, sold for about $700. Multiply that by 200. That comes to about $140,000, or about $3.5 million in today's money. Slaves were routinely insured. See, that's where this is coming up today. Insurance companies that have been around that long, they're having to admit that they used to insure slaves. Yeah, because the policy is guarded against damage. Hmm. Wow. I'm going to read you something that one of the descendants of Franklin said, but first I want to read you this. It's a marker. Let's see. A marker dealing with the compound active from 1833 to 1836. The slave trading firm Franklin and Armfield, operated by Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard, was one of the largest in American history. During its 8 years in New Orleans, the firm sold about 2,000 enslaved people in the city. Okay? All right, where's the other one? The other one was, oh yeah, here it is. Forks of the Road. I'm going to tell you I was going to come back to that, right? Forks of the Road, site of the South's second largest slave market in the 19th century, that's 1800s. Enslaved people were also once sold on city streets and at the landing at Natchez under the hill. Natchez slaves were freed in July 1863 when Union troops occupied the city. The Forks of the Road market then became a refuge for hundreds of emancipated people. See, I don't know. Maybe y'all are much more advanced than me in understanding about how about how much slave selling went on down there in New Orleans. I really didn't know. In fact, I never really knew how much internal selling went on. And I'm gonna read you what this descendant of slaves, of descendant of Franklin, had to say about this. Listen to this. His name was Thompson. Okay, he wrote an article in the Memphis Examiner. It said, this is the headline: Isaac Franklin was a well-liked slave trader. Okay, here's a question he was asked. How does a person inside the family measure the inheritance of slave trading? Quote, you can't judge these people by today's standards. You can't judge anybody by our standards. It was a part of life in those days. He says, I do not approve of revisionist historians. I mean, people who do not understand the old lifestyles, their standpoint on life, and their education are what today we consider limited. This applies to Southern history, to slave history. You know, I have been around blacks all my life. They are great people. When I grew up, we were servanted. All the servants were black. We had a nurse, a woman who used to be called a mammy. We had a cook, a black man. We had a maid, and we had a yard man. We had a guy that doubled as a driver and supervised the warehouse. And we had all those servants until they died. I wasn't taught to be proud. And I tell you what nobody ever talks about. Um, there were free blacks in the South that owned slaves, and there were lots of them. They didn't buy slaves in order to free them, but to make money. Thompson emphasizes these last sentences. It is a refrain among Southern whites who remain emotionally attached to the plantation days that 1 in 1,000 slaveholders who were black vindicates in some fashion 999 who were not. Question: are we responsible for what slave traders did? Quote: no, we cannot be responsible, should not feel like we're responsible. We weren't there. Are we accountable? No, we are not accountable for what happened then. In my family, people looked after their slaves. They bought shoes for them, blankets for them, brought in doctors to treat them. I never heard of any mistreatment. Stop. How do you say that? Let me say that again. He said, I never heard of any mistreatment. They were enslaved, but in his head, slavery was not a mistreatment by itself. Excuse me. Fine, let me continue. Quote: on the whole, things weren't that bad. You see, blacks were better off coming to this country. It is a fact that the ones over here are far ahead of the ones over there in Africa. Jesus. Human bondage began, I don't know when, but early thousands of years ago. I think slavery developed here primarily because of the ignorance of blacks. They first came over here as indentured servants, as did the whites. But because of their background and lack of education, they just sort of slid into slavery. Ooh, Lord. New Orleans was the biggest slave market in the country. Let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about. In 1820, the number of ships carrying slaves from eastern ports into New Orleans. Now, understand, this is not from Africa. This is from the eastern ports. Remember we looked at Norfolk, Virginia, and over there? In 1820, the number of ships from eastern ports into New Orleans was 604. In 1827, 7 years later, it was 1,359. In 1835, that was 7 more years later, it was 4,723. The auction advertisements at the end of the slave trail always said Virginia and Maryland Negroes. The words Virginia Negroes was a kind of a brand. It meant compliant, gentle, and not broken by overwork. There was also the fancy trade. New Orleans had a niche market. The fancy trade meant women sold as forcible sex partners. They were women of mixed race, usually. Sometimes they were called mulattoes or mulatresses. Okay? Now, These guys, Franklin and Armfield, they went on to die, um, wealthy, of course. Let me read you when Franklin's when Franklin died and his estate was sold off. It said, look at this. It says, I will sell on Monday, the 12th day of November next, to the highest bidder for cash, Fairview, the late residence of Isaac Franklin, deceased, 4 miles southwest of Gallatin. The following slaves, and then there's a list. The list is just a bunch of a whole bunch of men and their wives and their children, housekeeper, carpenter. Look at that whole list. Mariah Britton and her 2 children, and Jacob and Diana John Barons and his wife Letha and their 3 children, and Louisa their 3 children, and 2 children, and Jesus. Levied upon to satisfy 2 executions from the Supreme Court in my hands for collecting, the one in favor of John Armfield and the other in favor of O.B. Hayes, both against the goods and chattels, lands, and tenements of Isaac Franklin, deceased, in the hands of William Franklin, Horace F. Anderson, John W. Franklin, and Albert C. Franklin, trustees of charity under the will of said Isaac Franklin, deceased. The sale will continue from day to day until all or sufficiency of said slaves to pay said executioners and costs are sold. That was 1855, October 22nd. I'm just, there's some things that just really just blow me away. Now here's what happened too with all the breakup of all these families. Um, Once the emancipation came about, one of the things that happened, you had hundreds of thousands of black people trying to find their families. Yeah, think about that. So the first thing that happened in the summer of 1865, as soon as the war was over, former enslaved people, there were 4 million former slaves. First, they went about by word of mouth trying to find their family members. And then they went and started putting announcements in the newspapers, trying to find mothers and sisters, children and husbands that were sold away on the slave trail. Hannah Cole was one of the first. On June 24th, 1865, 2 months after the truce at Appomattox, in a Philadelphia newspaper called the Christian Recorder, she posted this: information wanted. Can anyone inform me of the whereabouts of John Person, son of Hannah Person of Alexandria, Virginia, who belonged to Alexander Sanctor? I have not seen him for 10 years. I was sold to Joseph Bruin, who took me to New Orleans. My name was then Hannah Person. It is now Hannah Cole. This is the only child I have, and I desire to find him much. It wasn't easy to put an ad in the paper because back then, if you earned 50 cents a day, it cost you 2 days' wages to put an ad in the paper. Then black churches picked it up. And I never realized this. The announcements in the church, which still go on today, that started from people trying to find their family members. And so every Sunday, preachers around the South looked out at the congregations and read announcements from lost friends. That's what they call them, lost friends. And a message from a woman who had been snatched from her mother when she was a girl might reach hundreds of thousands of people through the announcements in the church. Here's an example. I wish to inquire for my relatives whom I left in Virginia about 25 years ago. My mother's name was Matilda. She lived near Wilton, Virginia, and belonged to a Mr. Percival. I was sold with a younger sister, Betty. My name was Mary, and I was 9 years old when sold to a trader named Walker, who carried us to North Carolina. Betty was sold to a man named Reed, and I was sold and carried to New Orleans, and from there to Texas. I had a brother, Sam, and a sister, Annie, who were left with mother. If they are alive, I will be glad to hear from them. Signed, Mary Haynes. The sad thing was that for so many, almost everybody, the break was permanent. They never found their relatives. And so we grieve even down to today. Sometimes we don't even know what the grieving is about. Every once in a while, there was a reunion. One of them was this one. Robert Glenn was sold at 8 years old from his mother and father in North Carolina and spent the rest of his childhood in Kentucky. After emancipation, he's now about 20, and he remembered the name of his hometown, Roxborough. So he decided to go back to his birthplace and look for his parents. He said, I made a vow that I was going to North Carolina and see my mother if she was still living. After a few days, Glenn turned up in Roxborough, and there, in an accident hardly repeated by the million on the slave trail, he found his mother. He said, I shook my mother's hand, and she said, but she had last seen him when he was 8 and did not recognize him. He said that later she came to him and said, ain't you my child? Tell me, ain't you my child who I left on the road near Mr. Moore's before the war? And he said, I broke down and began to cry. I did not know before I came home whether my parents were dead or alive. And now my mother does not know me. Yeah. Yeah. So we want to remember the 1,000-mile slave trail. So you never saw that in the movies. See, this is why it's so tricky. They dictate what movies will be made about slavery. And so they only deal with certain things. You never saw a movie about the internal slave trade in the United States. You never heard about the 1,000-mile trail. You never saw that map before. Never saw that map before. Okay? And there's a reason for it. Never knew there was a long trail. So I'm going to close now. Thank you for your patience. And hopefully you'll be able to take this information, do your own research, and go further. Now that you know about the Armfield Coffles. All right. As always, no justice, no peace, no love. KNOW.